2 decades after John Lennon's assassination, an intruder's blade came within millimetres of making George Harrison the second Beatle to be murdered. In the dead of night on December the 30th, 1999, a deranged trespasser broke into Harrison's 120-room Friar Park mansion and lunged at the so-called quiet Beatle with a kitchen knife. This was no minor scuffle. Harrison was stabbed repeatedly, more than 40 times, puncturing a lung, before his wife Olivia courageously fought off the attacker with a lamp and fireplace poker. It was a scene of terror and even of surreal irony. The most spiritual, peace-loving Beatle forced into a life-or-death struggle in his own home. Harrison survived the ordeal, barely, and even mustered a flash of dry wit afterward. He wasn't a burglar, and he certainly wasn't auditioning for the travelling Wilburys, Harrison quipped of his would-be killer when asked what the man wanted. He then added a sobering proverb: "Life is fragile like a raindrop on a lotus leaf, and you better believe it." This shocking night was a late chapter in a life full of such contradictions and dramas, a life in which a shy Liverpool boy transformed into a world-famous musician, spiritual seeker, occasional libertine, and beloved musical icon. To understand how George Harrison ended up battling an intruder at 58, we will have to rewind to the very start of his journey. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. George Harrison was born on February the 25th, 1943, in a tiny 2-up, 2-down house at 12 Arnold Grove in the Wavertree area of Liverpool. He was the youngest of 4 children in a working-class Catholic family, which was, like many Liverpudlian families, including those of all his fellow Beatles, of Irish origin. His father, Harold, was a bus conductor and former ship's steward. His mother, Louise, worked as a shop assistant. The Harrisons were close-knit and by all accounts a nurturing bunch. Louise in particular encouraged her children's love of music. When George was 4, the family moved to a council house at 25 Upton Green in Speke, leaving behind the cramped terrace with its outdoor toilet and single coal fireplace. In Speke, George grew up in the shadow of wartime rationing and post-war austerity, but also amid the skiffle craze and the first flickers of rock and roll that were firing up British youths. Quiet and thoughtful by nature, he developed an early obsession with guitars and songs, and he was much more interested in listening to records on his older siblings' gramophone than in any kind of schoolwork. As a boy, George passed his 11+ exam, and this earned him admission to the prestigious Liverpool Institute High School, a place where he would eventually meet another music-mad kid named Paul McCartney. By the time they started to chat on the bus, George had already fallen hard for rock and roll and begun teaching himself the guitar. Paul, in turn, was struck by how much the younger boy had already learned. In those mid-1950s days, Harrison was soaking up a broad range of influences that were beyond what most teens cared for. He listened to the sinuous jazz guitar of Django Reinhardt and the wistful croon of Hoagie Carmichael, then fell for the raucous skiffle rhythms of Lonnie Donegan and the rockabilly twang of Carl Perkins. But the lightning bolt had truly struck in 1956 when young George heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel for the first time. Everything changed in that moment. As George later recalled, the sound of Elvis's voice and guitar opened up a new world. He pestered his parents for a guitar of his own, and Harold Harrison eventually relented, buying his 13-year-old son a cheap Dutch-made Eggman flat-top acoustic. The action was high and the instrument challenging, but George's determination was such that he taught himself chords and formed a makeshift skiffle group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend. By age 15, George Harrison was a capable young guitarist prowling for an opportunity. That opportunity came through Paul McCartney. In early 1958, Paul, now playing with a local Liverpool band called the Quarrymen, led by John Lennon, invited George to meet John and possibly join the group. John Lennon, nearly 18 and the hard-edged leader of the band, thought George at 15 was too young and baby-faced to join them. Legend has it that one night on the top deck of a Liverpool bus, George auditioned for Lennon by playing the instrumental guitar showcase titled Raunchy. In that dimly lit bus, Harrison's fingers flew over the frets with a skill that belied his age. John was won over. The kid could really play. With Paul's encouragement, George Harrison officially became a member of their scruffy little band. The Quarrymen gave George a crash course in rock and roll survival and were soon gaining an energetic following around Liverpool. As skiffle gave way to rock and roll, the group evolved through several names, including Johnny and the Moondogs and the Silver Beatles, before finally settling on the Beatles, with an A, in mid-1960. The new name, coined by John Lennon and his art school mate Stuart Sutcliffe, was partly a tribute to Buddy Holly's crickets, and partly a Lennon pun on the beat of rock music. By that summer, with Sutcliffe on bass and Pete Best joining as drummer, the Beatles lineup was nearly complete and about to be tested by fire. If you want to hear all about Stu Sutcliffe, have a gander at my episode on him, which you can find in the description and on screen now. To cut a long and fascinating story short, Stu didn't cut it as a bassist, and his role went to McCartney before he tragically died at just 21. Now, before we go on, there's one thing about George that is sometimes overlooked, how stylish the man was. He was a real dandy, and if you want to look just as fab, I'd recommend checking out the Rock and Roll Mysteries store, which is linked on screen now. Over there I have a range of exclusive t-shirts for sale, all of which have been designed by yours truly. Just recently I added 3 new designs featuring Debbie Harry, Jimi Hendrix, and Cass Elliot. They sit alongside the other shirts which feature stars like Brian Jones, Graham Parsons and Mark Bolan. They are made from premium cotton and start at just $25 a piece and ship from a variety of countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, Canada and Australia. Every sale is a massive help to the channel, and I very much appreciate all of you who have bought one so far. Have a gander and see what takes your fancy. Right, let's get back to George Harrison. In August 1960, the lads took an infamous gig in Hamburg, West Germany, where they played sleazy clubs on the Reeperbahn red light district for hours on end, getting it together, amidst prostitutes, pimps and bucket loads of amphetamines. George, not even 18, lied about his age to get permission to perform in the all-night clubs. The baptism by fire in Hamburg truly forged the Beatles' sound and their brotherhood. Packed into a squalid room behind a cinema with no heat and bunks crawling with vermin, the band bonded in ways few others ever do. Harrison later recalled one particularly eye-opening rite of passage from those days. It was in Hamburg that he lost his virginity at age 17, in the narrow bunk room while his bandmates pretended not to watch. They couldn't really see anything because I was under the covers, George said years later, but after I'd finished, they all applauded and cheered. Marvellous. Well, such was the rough and tumble nature of these young Beatles. As Paul McCartney joked, it was not uncommon in those Hamburg days to walk in on a bandmate mid-shag, mutter an apology, and walk right back out. Through the endless nights playing raucous rock and roll and living in each other's pockets, George went from the shy kid brother of the group to a fully fledged rock guitarist with worldly experiences well beyond his years. He even won himself a charming souvenir of the Reeperbahn in the form of a sexually transmitted infection. In fact, all the Beatles apparently contracted gonorrhea during that wild Hamburg stint, to their enduring embarrassment and juvenile humour. By 1961, back in Liverpool, the Beatles had begun building a serious local following. George's mother Louise was often in the audience at the Cavern Club, cheering the band on, which was very sweet of her. In fact, Louise Harrison was an unusually supportive Beatle parent, and she even answered fan mail sent to her home. Though she was less enthused about the hysterical mobs that would soon camp outside her house. Watching young girls scream and faint over her son and his bandmates, in 1963, a sassy Louise remarked in a letter that it made her, quote, really ashamed to be female. By 1962, they had a record contract. Pete Best was out and notable local drummer Ringo Starr in, and the Beatles as the world would know them were set. John, Paul, George and Ringo. It all happened astonishingly fast. The Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, charted in late 1962. By early 1963, they were a phenomenon in Britain, and by 1964, global Beatlemania was in full swing. George Harrison, the youngest Beatle, went from sleeping in mouldy Hamburg rooms to playing the biggest stages in the world before he was 21. With his fine-boned face, brooding dark eyes and thick chestnut hair, George was adored by millions of fans, especially the girls. His quiet demeanour and shy half-smile only stoked the mystique. On stage, he stood a bit apart from the riotous energy of John and Paul, concentrating on his guitar, but to many female fans that made him all the more alluring. George was known as the quiet one of the group with a soulful aura. His bandmates affectionately teased him for being the baby of the band, but George was maturing quickly in the crucible of Beatlemania. Yet even as screaming fans chased their limousine and the Beatles became the idols of the age, George Harrison harboured private discontents that would soon come boiling to the surface. At the height of their fame, when every show was sold out and every hit topped the charts, Harrison began to wonder if being a Beatle was, in fact, all he had once dreamed, or whether the life of a rock superstar was costing him something more important. The world saw four carefree young men ruling pop music, but inside the band, George was chafing at his junior status. How long, he would soon ask himself, could he remain the so-called economy-class Beatle when his own muse was demanding to be heard? In the Lennon-McCartney songwriting juggernaut, Harrison found himself cast as the little brother who might get the odd song or two on an album, if he was lucky. One of George's first compositions, Don't Bother Me, appeared on the 1963 album With the Beatles, almost as if to placate him, much as Ringo was given one vocal spotlight per record. George's songwriting voice developed more slowly than the mercurial Lennon-McCartney team, but by the mid-1960s, he was catching up and he was doing it by himself. He penned Taxman to open the 1966 album Revolver, a biting complaint about Britain's high taxes that also undercut his own public image as a seeker above material concerns, hardly an anthem for the 60s socialism that Liverpool was famous for. Even as he railed against the material world, Harrison couldn't resist writing one of pop's first anti-tax anthems, although in fairness, a song telling the British government to get their beak out of his bank account was a refreshing change of subject from the Beatles' usual boy meets girl fare of the early 60s. But it would be unfair to characterise George's interests so narrowly, of course. He explored Indian music and philosophy in songs like Love You Too and Within You Without You, bringing the sounds of the sitar and tabla into Western pop. By 1968, when the Beatles ventured into epic rock territory, George contributed While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a moody masterpiece made even more memorable by the lead guitar of his friend Eric Clapton, whom George recruited to play on the track as a rare outside guest. In 1969, as the Beatles were coming apart, George blossomed with two of his finest songs. Here Comes the Sun, a radiant acoustic ode to hope written in Clapton's garden, and Something, a tender love ballad that would become one of the band's most covered classics. Frank Sinatra himself later praised Something as, quote, the greatest love song of the past 50 years, although Sinatra, like many fans, assumed it was a Lennon-McCartney composition and not the work of the Quiet One. By dogged persistence, Harrison had elbowed his way into the Beatles' first-class cabin with songs that could stand proudly alongside Lennon's and McCartney's. For all his musical growth, Harrison still struggled with his role in the band. He had accepted being the workmanlike lead guitarist on stage during their live era, dutifully executing his solos while John and Paul soaked up the spotlight. But offstage and in the studio, he bristled at being undervalued. Tensions came to a head in January 1969 during the fractious Let It Be sessions. Fed up with Paul McCartney's creative domineering and John Lennon's distraction with new love Yoko Ono, George abruptly quit the band after one particularly strained rehearsal. "See you around the clubs," he snapped as he walked out. This was a jab that implied he might rather be an anonymous guitarist in a pub than endure another day of Beatles infighting. The departure was short-lived. After a few days and a peace summit at Ringo's house, Harrison agreed to return to the group. But his brief rebellion shook the others. In a private meeting captured on tape, John Lennon coldly suggested that if George didn't come back, the Beatles could simply call up Eric Clapton to replace him. Paul and Ringo, shocked, insisted they wanted their friend back, not a substitute, and least of all one who was George's best mate. More on that later. George did come back, and the band carried on to record Abbey Road, but the writing was on the wall. The camaraderie of the early days was gone. Harrison in particular was increasingly detached, pouring his energy into his own backlog of songs. As he later revealed, he had dozens of unrecorded tunes stockpiled, waiting for the inevitable day when the Beatles would no longer occupy all his creative real estate. In August 1969, the Beatles gave their last public performance, the famous impromptu rooftop concert in London, and by April of 1970, the band had split for good. Of all the Beatles, George seemed the least conflicted about the breakup, and there was a good reason for that. It was, as he said, a relief in many ways. Indeed, with the Beatles behind him, 27-year-old George Harrison spread his wings gloriously and launched himself into the most impressive solo career in the immediate post-Beatles aftermath. Within months, he went into the studio to record All Things Must Pass, the song he had demoed on his 26th birthday back in February 1969 as a kind of personal farewell to the Beatles era. That song became the title track of his colossal debut solo album, a triple LP also called All Things Must Pass, released at the end of 1970. It was as if a dam had burst. The album featured a wealth of material Harrison had been stifling or holding back during the Beatle years. Lush, grandiose productions, co-produced with Phil Spector, fusing rock and gospel and Hindustani influences. The standout single, My Sweet Lord, was a radiant mantra-like song that seamlessly wove together the Christian Hallelujah with a Hindu Hare Krishna refrain, which really reflected George's eclectic spirituality, one that was far more genuine and deep-rooted than the brief posturing of his fellow Beatles. It shot to number 1 worldwide, affirming that Harrison could more than hold his own as a solo artist. Although there was a negative coda to the song, Harrison was successfully sued by a record company in 1976 over the similarity to the Chiffons hit He's So Fine and ordered to pay out $1.5 million. The case was a landmark and opened up a cascade of similar lawsuits against artists for so-called subconscious plagiarism, largely stemming from the aggressively litigious actions of former Beatles manager Alan Klein. The controversy and lawsuits somewhat tainted the lead single but did little to slow the success of the album. In fact, All Things Must Pass topped the charts and eventually far outsold the debut solo albums of Lennon and McCartney. And Harrison would later wryly call this an unextinguishable last laugh. Critics hailed it as arguably the finest Beatles solo album, full stop. After years of being relegated to a song or two per album, Harrison suddenly had a number 1 record, packed with hits and acclaimed deep cuts, his own statement to the world. His songwriting had matured to express grand, universal themes, often with a spiritual bent. His songs were about deeper themes than dating, social commentary, or politics. He wanted to express something metaphysical in his lyrics. Listeners could now clearly discern what George was driving at in songs that grappled with God, love, and the self. Harrison's blossoming was not just musical but also personal. In January 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, he had married Pattie Boyd, a fashionable model he'd met on the set of A Hard Day's Night. Pattie was the epitome of the swinging 60s London scene, beautiful, cool as a cucumber, and instantly popular with the Beatles circle. George wrote the love song Something with Pattie partly in mind, and the two were one of the era's iconic couples. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, George's spiritual quest and his rock and roll lifestyle pulled him in conflicting directions. By 1973 to 74, the marriage to Pattie was on the rocks. Harrison's immersion in Indian spirituality, he had travelled to India with Pattie in 1966, taken sitar lessons from Ravi Shankar, and later spent weeks in meditation with a Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, gave him a certain philosophical detachment, but it didn't curb his appetites for other pleasures. He took to using cocaine and alcohol heavily in the mid-1970s, and ironically, for a man preaching enlightenment, he was serially unfaithful to his wife, and Patty is on record as describing their home, Friar Park, as a madhouse in their final years there due to the excess and Harrison's behaviour. The most notorious transgression was an affair with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. By various accounts, George's seduction of his best friend's wife happened casually and repeatedly, a betrayal that staggered their circle. The affair came to light on an intimate evening just before Christmas, 1973. George gathered Patty, Maureen, Ringo, and their friend, Chris O'Dell, and made a shocking announcement. He was in love with Maureen. For Patty Boyd, that was the final straw. As she later recounted, George's affair with Maureen, coupled with his worsening cocaine use and indifference to her, drove Patty to leave him in 1974. She moved out of their home. Friar Park had been purchased in 1970, and it was a sprawling Victorian estate he famously filled with whimsical gnomes and 400 varieties of flowers, and straight into the arms of another man. In a twist that was the talk of rock aristocracy, Patty found comfort with Eric Clapton, who had himself been pining for her for years. Clapton had fallen madly in love with Patty during the late 60s, pouring his unrequited passion into the searing guitar ballad Layla in 1970, while Patty was still Mrs. Harrison. Now with her marriage to George in ruins, Patty and Eric clandestinely began a relationship. George Harrison, perhaps numb from the bottle of brandy he was chugging every day at that point, didn't erupt in jealousy as one might expect. In fact, in an almost surreal display of cool, George more or less gave the couple his blessing. Hell, ultimately it's only a woman, he bitterly joked with a shrug, an insulting statement which at best was an attempt to mask whatever hurt he must have felt. In fairness, he would have been an almighty hypocrite to have reacted negatively to the news. He poured himself into songwriting and wrote the song Can't Stop Thinking About You for Patty at this time, a raw piece that is devoid of his usual spiritual pretensions. The album that followed, Extra Texture, was something of a return to form after the flop that was 1974's Dark Horse. By 1977, Patty and George's divorce was finalised, and 2 years later, in 1979, she married Eric Clapton. George not only accepted this, he even attended their wedding party, smiling for photos as the ex-husband, witnessing his friend marry his former wife. The triangle that would have destroyed many friendships seemingly left Harrison unruffled, at least outwardly. He and Clapton remained friends. They would even tour together in the 90s, and Harrison later even referred to Eric as his husband-in-law. It was an odd resolution to a rock and roll soap opera, one that cemented Harrison's image as almost unnaturally zen about the entanglements of love. But the truth was more complicated. Harrison's own behaviour had more or less sabotaged the marriage. And Patty herself noted that George's detachment had as much to do with his own guilt and distractions as with any higher enlightenment. While his first marriage was disintegrating, Harrison poured himself into music and new ventures. In 1971, just months after the Beatles' breakup, George pulled off one of his noblest deeds. He organised the Concert for Bangladesh, the first major all-star charity rock concert, to raise money for refugees of the Bangladesh Liberation War. Appalled by the humanitarian crisis unfolding in South Asia, Harrison teamed up with his mentor, Ravi Shankar, to stage 2 Madison Square Garden shows featuring the likes of Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Ringo Starr. The concerts and subsequent live album raised millions for relief efforts and set the template for the big rock charity events that followed in later decades, from Live Aid to countless benefit shows. In the same period, Harrison was also evangelizing Eastern spirituality in the West. He had embraced Hindu philosophy, chanting, and meditation with no little fervor. He even produced a surprising UK hit single in 1969 titled Hare Krishna Mantra, performed by devotees from the London Radha Krishna Temple, which introduced the Hare Krishna chant onto Western pop radio. The song peaked at number 12 and was even played as the halftime entertainment at a Manchester United football match. However, in the US, the single was more or less blacklisted from airplay due to concerns about the reaction from Christian groups, and it failed to chart. During the first half of the 70s, George was often seen in the company of orange-robed swamis, sporting a scraggly beard, handing out copies of spiritual books and talking about the oneness of mankind. A far cry from the suited mop-top image of just a few years before. Some fans found it inspiring, others were baffled by the Beatles' rapid transformation into a quasi-guru figure. Harrison himself, however, remained self-aware and often gently mocked his own image. He titled his 1973 album Living in the Material World, a joke of sorts about the tug-of-war between his metaphysical ideals and the temptations of earthly life. Fame, fortune, and yes, fast cars. He loved sports cars and even Formula One racing passionately. Musically, the mid-1970s were a mixed bag for Harrison. After the triumph of All Things Must Pass, his subsequent albums were lower key and sometimes patchy. He launched his own record label, Dark Horse Records, and that gave birth to the poorly received 1974 album Dark Horse I mentioned earlier. This new moniker seemed to capture his self-image as the underestimated, somewhat outsider ex-Beatle. During a 1974 North American tour, the first tour by a Beatle since the band's breakup, George's voice was ravaged by laryngitis and rough from cocaine abuse. This earned him the nickname Dark Horse, with an A again. He frustrated some audiences by performing rearranged Beatles songs with a preachy spin, even changing some lyrics to reflect his spiritual ideals, and by giving long showcases to Indian musicians in his band. Critics panned some shows, and Harrison's relationship with the press soured as he snapped at journalists. The experience left a bad taste. He wouldn't tour again for many years. By 1975, perhaps sensing that his moment in the pop spotlight had passed, at least in terms of his enjoyment of it, Harrison retreated from the rock star rat race. He later said he had no desire to be on the wheel of constant album tours like his peers. Instead, he decamped to his neo-Gothic mansion, indulged his love of gardening on its 62-acre grounds. He planted hundreds of trees and built elaborate landscaping projects himself, and explored other interests. One of those interests unexpectedly made Harrison a film producer and a genuine saviour of British comedy cinema, which was in the doldrums by the mid-70s. In 1978, when his Monty Python friends were struggling to finance their biblical spoof, Life of Brian, after EMI Films pulled out, George stepped in. A huge Python fan, Harrison literally mortgaged his home to raise the £3 million needed to fund Life of Brian, just because, as he said, he wanted to see the movie. This astonishing act, called, quote, the most anyone's ever paid for a cinema ticket by Python's Eric Idle, launched Harrison into a new role as a movie mogul. He co-founded Handmade Films, which went on to produce a string of acclaimed British films in the 1980s, from the Python Fast Time Bandits to the legendary With Nail and I. And yeah, I can see your comments about Danny already. Go on, pile them up, I ain't denying it. Just don't be rude about the delicate Cockney manner of verbalising, or me and presuming Ed will be over with our doll collection, alright? Anyway, in doing so, Harrison almost single-handedly helped fuel a renaissance in British cinema. Handmade Films made money and prestige, but Harrison was hardly in the Harry Cohn mould. He was more likely to be found strumming a ukulele between takes than hiring hitmen or chasing some Hollywood starlet around his office. In fact, he would chuckle that being a producer was just sitting around waiting. I'm good at that, he said. Still, one can draw a line between his financing of Python's irreverent comedy and his financing of Eastern religious chants. Both reflected a deeply personal urge to share what he loved, whether sacred or profane, with a wider world. Amid these ventures, Harrison found romantic happiness again by the late 1970s. In 1977, the same year his divorce from Patty was finalized, George noticed a dark-eyed young woman working as a secretary at his Los Angeles music office. Olivia Trinidad Arias, a bilingual Mexican-American who handled correspondence at Dark Horse Records, caught his eye. They struck up a friendship by telephone and then in person. Olivia was grounded, smart, and like a lot of Mexican women, not a gal to be messed with. She was also not part of the wild rock star scene. She shared George's interest in spirituality to a degree, but also kept him tethered to practical life. They fell in love and Harrison cleaned up his act. He dialed back the drugs and drink as he settled into a quieter domestic life. In 1978 they married, and a month later their son Dhani Harrison was born. Fatherhood seemed to mellow George. Friends observed him doting on baby Dhani and embracing the ordinary joys of family life that he'd missed after disappearing into the world of rock and roll at just 17. He still wrote songs and recorded, but at his own pace. One of his late 70s songs, the upbeat Blow Away, captured the contentment of that period. Its lyrics speaking of worries dissolving like clouds when he remembers all I got to do is to love you. As often, the you in George's songs could well have been Olivia or a higher spirit or both. In 1980, tragedy struck his Beatle family when John Lennon was shot and killed in New York. Harrison was devastated by John's murder. It was a brutal reminder of the perils of fame and the fragility of life, themes he had long contemplated. The following year, George released a gentle tribute to John, the song All Those Years Ago, which reflected on their time together and mourned his fallen friend. Fittingly, Ringo played drums on it, and Paul contributed backing vocals, a Beatles near reunion. Through the early 1980s, Harrison kept a relatively low profile in music, preferring to sign new artists to his label or dabble in film production. John's murder had made him cautious, and by 1982, he began a long process of beefing up security around him and his family and spending less time in public. He said that he might happily become a full-time gardener. Indeed, if you visited Friar Park in those days, you were as likely to find George on a tractor in muddy overalls as in a recording studio. However, the lure of music never left him for too long. In 1987, after a 5-year recording hiatus, Harrison made a comeback with the album Cloud 9. Working with Electric Light Orchestra's Jeff Lynne as co-producer, George crafted a polished, hook-filled record that yielded a US #1 hit, Got My Mind Set on You, which was a catchy cover of an old R&B tune that brought Harrison back to the top of the charts for the first time since My Sweet Lord. He followed it by co-founding a supergroup, the Traveling Wilburys, alongside friends Jeff Lynne, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and rock legend Roy Orbison. In this informal collaboration, each member took on a goofy pseudonym as a Wilbury brother. Harrison became Nelson Wilbury. The project was pure fun, 5 famous musicians writing jangly folk rock tunes with no pressure, and it revitalized George's joy in music. The Wilburys scored hit songs like Handle With Care and End of the Line, and they remained close even after Orbison's sudden death in 1988. These late 80s successes showed a Harrison more relaxed than ever, sporting a short modern haircut, grinning in music videos, and clearly relishing being part of a band again, but this time as an equal among peers, not a little brother in the shadow of giants. By the 1990s, George Harrison had comfortably settled into the role of elder statesman of rock. In 1994, he reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr to work on the Beatles anthology project, which included recording 2 new songs built around old demo tapes of John Lennon. Though old quarrels with Paul briefly flared during the project, some habits die hard, the 3 managed to come together amicably to celebrate their legacy. Harrison, however, remained cautious about any full-scale Beatles reunion or extensive public appearances. He famously said that he would only consider a Beatles reunion if we needed money, which thankfully we don't. He preferred the quiet of Friar Park, the company of his family and select friends, and the freedom to appear and disappear from the public eye at will. He would pop up unexpectedly, doing a cameo in a Monty Python comedy special here, jamming on stage at a Carl Perkins tribute there, then retreat again. Unlike Paul, who toured the world relentlessly and built a mighty music empire, or Ringo, who fronted his all-star band, George played the reluctant legend. That reluctance extended to the trappings of fame. Harrison turned down the offer of an OBE honour from the Queen in 2000, reportedly because he felt it was meaningless tokenism, especially since Paul McCartney had been knighted while George was offered a lesser honour, which likely touched a nerve in the old hierarchy. There's nothing very rock and roll about a knighthood anyway, it must be said. He never craved adulation. He often said he was happier gardening than receiving awards. Indeed, he once half-jokingly proposed that his ideal epitaph would be something like, "Here lies George Harrison. He loved gardens." In the 1990s, he did become known as one of the world's most famous gardeners, transforming Friar Park into a veritable Eden with exotic flora, water features, and even his infamous gnome garden. Filmmaker Terry Gilliam marveled that George's gardening was nearly as great an accomplishment as his music. Following a final TV appearance on a VH1 special in 1997, George was dealt a devastating blow. Long a heavy smoker, the habit had caught up with him. He was told by doctors he had throat cancer. Luckily, the illness was caught in time, and a course of radiotherapy seemed to have successfully defeated the disease. By January 1998, George was well enough to attend his idol, Carl Perkins' funeral, where he performed the Perkins classic, Your True Love. By the end of the 1990s, Harrison might have thought fate had finally granted him a measure of peace. A happy second marriage, a grown son following in his musical footsteps, escape from a brush with cancer, and a quiet life out of the tabloid glare. But fate had another horrifying trial in store. Just when life had settled into a gentler rhythm, the tranquility of Friar Park was shattered one winter's night, and the former Beatle found himself coughing up blood on his own staircase, grappling with an assailant in the darkness. The horror George endured that night would be followed by an even more insidious threat, ensuring that his final years became a race against time and mortality. As we saw in the beginning, on the night of December 30th, 1999, an intruder nearly ended George Harrison's life. The security at Friar Park was intense, with guards, dogs, barbed wire fences, and other systems in place. The assailant, Michael Abram, was suffering from schizophrenia and heroin addiction and had been in and out of mental institutions for the best part of a decade. Following the solar eclipse in 1999, he had come to believe that God was instructing him to kill George Harrison. So he set out to do just that. He entered the nearby village church and asked the vicar if the squire was around, apparently referring to Harrison, although the vicar had no idea what he meant. Following this, he managed to scale a high wall and evade security to enter the Harrison home. The Harrisons were first alerted by the sound of breaking glass. George went to see what was happening and found a blond man standing in front of him holding a 6-inch knife in his hands. As the man attacked, George wrestled with him in self-defense and began to chant a Hare Krishna mantra in an attempt to distract him, but it was to no avail, and the man repeatedly slashed at George's chest. He later described this moment saying, "I felt exhausted and could feel the strength draining from me. I vividly remember a deliberate thrust to my chest. I could hear my lung exhaling and had blood in my mouth. I believed I had been fatally stabbed." Meanwhile, Olivia sprung into action, beating Abrams over the head with a fire poker and a lamp, which halted the attack. Police were then called and an ambulance rushed George to the nearby Royal Berkshire Hospital, where he was treated for what were very serious injuries. One stab wound missed the superior vena cava by a hair, and rupturing that would have been certain death. He also had a lung removed after it was damaged beyond repair in the attack. Soon, however, as news broke around the world of the attack, it was announced that Harrison was stable, albeit in a lot of pain. 2 weeks later, he was home. But in truth, George never fully recovered from that night. As for Olivia, she took the witness stand at Abrams' trial and read a powerful statement, which included these lines. "There was blood on the walls and blood on the carpet. This was the moment I realized that we were gonna be murdered and that this man was succeeding in murdering us, and there was nobody else there to help." The judge ruled Abrams not guilty and sent him to a mental institution. He was released in under 2 years. A fact which deeply upset the then late Harrison's family. Abrams got a job, curiously enough, at the Citizens Advice Bureau, a well-known charity, offering people advice on financial, housing, and consumer matters, among other things. I'm not sure what kind of advice you'd want from a person like that, quite honestly. Mercifully, Olivia had shown immense courage and presence of mind in an incredibly terrifying situation, and probably saved her husband's life. Tom Petty later said, "When I heard about it, I sent George a fax. and it just said, "Aren't you glad you married a Mexican girl?" Olivia really kicked ass. In the aftermath, as he recovered, many noted the eerie parallel. Lennon had been felled by a crazed fan in 1980, and now another madman had tried to take Harrison. Harrison found it in himself to forgive Abrams, and indeed he emerged from the stabbing with a renewed appreciation for the preciousness of each day. Tragically, he did not have many days left. In 2001, not long after the stabbing incident, Harrison received grim news. The cancer had returned and spread. Some speculated that the immense stress and trauma of the 1999 attack helped trigger the recurrence of his illness. Even his son Danny said, "It definitely took years off of his life. You know, if you're trying to fight cancer and then you're trying to stay alive from something like that, it's got to take it out of you." His old mucker, Keith Richards, agreed, saying, "I think he probably would have beaten the cancer if it wasn't for the blade. I mean, we know that he didn't die from being stabbed, but I'm sure that it sort of broke down his resistance to what he had to deal with." Whether or not that is true, by spring 2001, Harrison was fighting for his life against lung cancer that had metastasized to his brain. Ever private, George did his best to shield the severity of his illness from the media. In May 2001, he underwent surgery at the Mayo Clinic in the US to remove a cancerous lung lesion. "He has made an excellent recovery and is in the best of spirits," Harrison's lawyer announced cheerily at the time. With trademark gallows humor, the lawyer added that although all things must pass away, George has no plans right now and is still living in the material world. These words, almost certainly George's own, were a playful reference to two of Harrison's famous album titles and meant to reassure fans that he wasn't going anywhere. But by that summer, it was clear the situation was dire. Harrison travelled to a clinic in Switzerland for radiotherapy on a brain tumour in June 2001. He released a statement in July insisting, "I am feeling fine," and chiding the press for causing unnecessary worry. In truth, he was in the fight of his life. Reports swelled in mid-2001 that Harrison was close to death, especially after a clumsy news story emerged claiming Beatles producer George Martin had said George was at death's door. Harrison angrily refuted those stories, and Martin himself denied making such remarks. Untrue, insensitive, and uncalled for, George and Olivia called these premature obituaries, emphasizing that George was still active and feeling very well despite his health challenges. Indeed, through all the treatments, Harrison kept working on music when he could. He was determined to complete one final album, a project aptly titled Brainwash that he had been crafting in bits and pieces for years. Throughout 2001, even as cancer ravaged his body, Harrison painstakingly laid down vocal and guitar tracks for the songs that had been percolating in his mind. He enlisted Jeff Lynne and Danny to promise to finish the album if he could not. His life was in those final songs, Lynne later observed, everyday reflections, humour, spirituality, all distilled by a man who knew his time was short. Long-time friends like drummer Jim Keltner came by to contribute to the recordings. Keltner recalled the last time he saw George. He gave me a big hug and said, "You'll never know what you've meant to me, Jim." When we drove off, my wife said, "You know he was saying goodbye to us, don't you?" One of Harrison's last musical acts was notably in character. He helped a friend. In October 2001, despite increasing weakness, George mustered the energy to collaborate with Jools Holland, the British pianist and TV host, on a song called Horse to the Water. Recorded at Harrison's home studio, with George on guitar and vocals, and co-written with Danny, the track was a jaunty R&B number that appeared on Holland's album a few weeks later. In a final morbid touch, George credited the song not to his usual publishing name, Harrison's, but to RIP Music Limited, 2001, a darkly witty acknowledgement of his own mortality. By November 2001, as treatments proved futile, Harrison began putting his affairs in order. He visited New York for one last round of radiotherapy at Staten Island University Hospital, and while in Manhattan, something beautiful happened. The three surviving Beatles reunited one final time. On November 12, 2001, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr came to see George, who was convalescing at a hotel, having kept his presence in New York as low-key as possible. The old friends spent the day reminiscing and laughing together, according to Harrison's doctor who was present. There were some tears, but there was more laughter than anything else, said Dr. Gil Lederman of that bittersweet gathering. The three Beatles, all now in their late 50s, talked for hours, finding that familiar camaraderie once again. George, though weakened and knowing in his heart it was likely farewell, remained very much the man of dignity and was happy and calm after Paul and Ringo left. He understood this was goodbye. After all the scars and slights of their youth, the three had come full circle, not as Beatles, but as brothers. Just over 2 weeks later, on November 29th, 2001, George Harrison died in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. Olivia and Danny were with him, as was a small circle of very close friends. In accordance with his wishes, his passing was gentle and private. He had spent decades preparing himself spiritually for the moment of death, losing his fear of it. He gave his life to God a long time ago, Olivia noted, saying that George met the end with acceptance. He went with what was happening to him. In his final hours, Hare Krishna devotees chanted at his bedside, helping guide his soul in the Vedic tradition. One dear friend, the comedian and Python alum Michael Palin, would later reveal an uncanny detail. As George died, Palin saw what he described as a golden aura around his friend's bed, a glowing light that he found both inexplicable and profoundly moving. It was as if the spiritual grace Harrison had sought all his life briefly manifested in visible form at the moment he slipped away. The story of the golden aura spread and seemed fitting to many. George Harrison had always been reaching for something higher, and now it appeared heaven's light came to claim him. Harrison's earthly remains were cremated, and in accordance with his Hindu faith, his family later scattered his ashes in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India. At a private funeral in Los Angeles, his close family and friends gathered at the Self-Realization Fellowship Lake Shrine, a serene place he loved, to say goodbye. The world, however, mourned more publicly. Despite the shadow of 9/11 and global turmoil in late 2001, news of George's death led broadcasts and front pages. Fans gathered outside Abbey Road Studios in London, at Strawberry Fields in New York's Central Park, and in Liverpool at the Cavern Club to lay flowers and sing his songs. The tributes poured in from musicians across generations. Paul McCartney praised his baby brother and said he was lucky to have known him. Ringo Starr simply said, "I loved him dearly and I'm going to miss him." Perhaps his own words, written in the final message he left for the world, sum it up best. Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait, and love one another. Harrison may have often stood in the shadows of his louder bandmates, but in hindsight, his light shines just as brightly, a steady inner light of melody, conscience, and faith that continues to guide fans and fellow musicians alike. That's about all for this one. What's your favourite George track? I'm a big fan of Not Guilty. It has a great mood, like some smoky old jazz lounge, I reckon. Let me know yours in the comments. I've been Chester. Have a good one and see you next time. Cheers.